So, some nations have a common religion. Some nations have common ethnic identity. America doesn't have any of those things. So the role of ideals and narrative in the American nation is actually probably more important than it is in other nations. And what a national story does is it sort of makes you feel like you're part of something that's bigger than yourself, that's worth sacrificing for. Because, we want people to make sacrifices for the good of the nation. That's how the nation advances. We want people, if necessary, to put their lives on the line and defend the nation in war. And so to do that, we got to make them think there's something here that's worth fighting for. There's something that you're a part of.
Hello and welcome back to the Tell Me Mas podcast. My name is Victor Cornejo, and today I am so pumped to have this conversation. A few weeks ago, I picked up a book, and it's one of those great pieces of nonfiction that you pick up, and it tells you a story, and it just leads to more questions and more questions, and I did the silly thing of reaching out to this author, and he actually accepted to take the time today to speak to me, and I could not be more honored to be speaking to Professor Kermit Roosevelt III. He is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania, absolute expert in constitutional history as well as civil rights, and he's the author of several influential books. And his latest, the one I just picked up, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. It presents a really thought-provoking, enlightening conversation about who we are and what our values are. And like I mentioned, simply reached out, and I can't thank you enough, Professor, for taking the time and responding so quickly and being so open to having this conversation.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
No, absolutely. It is a fascinating book, and I came to it. Obviously, our current political climate is very motivating and kind of pushes you to do a little more research. But part of sort of the theory behind my little podcast here is that we all have lenses through which we view certain topics, and it's undeniable that I am as a first generation Latino, my parents are from Peru and Chile. The issue of politics and political values is very close to me and to my family. We're one of those weird families, and given your lineage, I'm sure it's no surprise to you, but every Sunday dinner with my parents and my kids and sister and brother-in-law, the first thing we ask each other is not how did your week go, but what's in the news? What do you think? How'd that go? And being of Latin American descent, politics is not something that you only address or think about every few months or every election cycle. But part of the reason why I'm here why I exist in America and I was born in White Plains, New York, is the fact that down there, when you elect somebody, things can change overnight. Like your entire life changes overnight. And so I'm on this continuous search to learn more and more about who we are as Americans, where my place exists in America. And weirdly enough, as right now, and it ties very, very much into some of the themes in your book, I feel a little like I'm trying to find my place. Like, where do I actually belong? Am I an outsider or am I truly an insider? I believe, my family believes, we are absolute insiders. We are Americans. And so I go down this search of trying to find more resources to learn from about who we actually are. And I pick up your book, and it's just fascinating to me and brings up so many questions. And at the very beginning, you talk about the standard story that we tell ourselves as Americans. Before we dig into that, why are these stories important? Why do these matter? Why do societies have to tell themselves these stories?
So the general idea there is that stories are how we make meaning. There's a bunch of stuff that happens and it's sort of chaos, but then you organize it into a narrative and you find a theme and you figure out who the heroes and the villains are. And now it's a story and it has meaning. And this is something that people do, I think, as individuals with their own lives. You sort of understand your life in narrative form, and there are themes that go on in your life, and you've got goals, and there are people who are trying to help you, and there are people who are trying to stop you, and all of that. So one thing is, people just like to find meaning in the world. This is a way we find meaning. The other point is that for nations, if a nation is going to survive, people have to believe it's worth fighting for. They have to feel some sense of loyalty or identification. And what the national story does, and different nations organize themselves in different ways. So, some nations have a common religion. Some nations have common ethnic identity. America doesn't have any of those things. So the role of ideals and narrative in the American nation is actually probably more important than it is in other nations. And what a national story does is it sort of makes you feel like you're part of something that's bigger than yourself, that's worth sacrificing for. Because, we want people to make sacrifices for the good of the nation. That's how the nation advances. We want people, if necessary, to put their lives on the line and defend the nation in war. And so to do that, we got to make them think there's something here that's worth fighting for. There's something that you're a part of.
I am, your prototypical American kid, right? And my education in American history is what I got through great, great public schools. And I've felt that it's funny. I think I've almost gotten an advantage over, let's say, a white American kid who was born here generations, because the influence of the American story has been so important in the formation of Latin America. I mean, our Constitution was the template for the constitutions of many Latin American countries. And as such, our history has been so affected both positively and negatively by the American experience. But I almost feel like I got told more of those stories of who America was and what they stood for and what the values were than I think, the average kid. And I wish, after reading your book, I wish I'd been able to dig in deeper. So you start out by telling about the standard story. I'd love to hear from you. What is the standard story that we are telling ourselves even today?
So the standard story, the reason I call it standard is it's the mainstream version that's out there. And it's basically what's taught in middle school and high school history or civics classes. It's maybe most identifiably what you hear politicians say. So politicians will get out there and they'll say, remember these heroes of our history, remember these principles, remember these great moments, remember these foundational documents. This is what America stands for. This is what makes America. And basically the way that story goes is American history starts with this great moment, 1776. If you want to narrow it down even further, you could say July 4th, although it's not quite accurate. But it's the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence states these foundational American ideals, which are, importantly, like what we believe in now as Americans. So liberty for everyone, that's something we believe in, and equality. All men are created equal. So we've got these ideals, liberty and equality. They're stated in this short document. It's nice, like people can memorize it. Handy to have a short document that states your ideals. And then, to show that we really believe in this, we put our lives on the line for them. We fight a war. And that's the Revolutionary War. And then after the war, we, are an independent nation and we're trying to organize ourselves. And so we write a document, a longer document that takes these ideals and really gives them the force of law so that now our society is really governed by these ideals. And that's the Constitution that's written in 1787. And then the story gets a little bit more complicated because, of course, it has to admit there's slavery at the time. But basically what happens then is America works itself pure over time, and we try to live up to those founders' ideals So like the big point for me, the big structural point about this story is the ideals are there at the very beginning. 1776 is sort of a high point. It's the purest expression of the American ideals. Founding America, the America of the late 18th century and the Revolution and the Constitution, it grows from those ideals, and then we're trying over time to more fully realize them. We're trying to fight this weird thing, slavery, which somehow happens to be there, contrary to our ideals.
Well, yeah. So yeah, I'd love a little more explanation to that, because I guess I just didn't realize until reading the book that when developing the Constitution, it's not like abolition was a new concept at the time, but it's more like either we go with continuing slavery or we don't really form a nation. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, so there are a couple of important points there. I think one is, of course, abolition existed. So people sometimes say, what's unique about America is that we ended slavery, right? We fought a war to end slavery. Well, one, like we were fighting a war against other Americans who were fighting a war to preserve slavery. But two, the story that people tell about slavery is just sort of wildly unrealistic because, yeah, it's true. Slavery existed for thousands of years all around the world. Like it existed just about everywhere in just about every period of human history. And at just about every period of human history, people were saying this is a terrible thing that you shouldn't do to other people. And then in most places, it got abolished. So different forms of slavery rose and fell with different justifications. And always there were people saying, wow, this is a terrible thing to do. And then there were people trying to come up with new justifications. So, Europeans used to enslave other Europeans, and that ended mostly in like the 14th century. So they understood slavery is a terrible thing. And by the time of colonial America, there was a pretty accepted widespread principle that you shouldn't enslave people who were like you in some relevant way. So Christians shouldn't enslave Christians, and Muslims shouldn't enslave Muslims, and white people maybe shouldn't enslave white people. So race-based slavery comes along, and it looks sort of new because now you've got a big system where you've got a racial line. And in that sense, American plantation slavery is a little bit new in its scale and its justification and its sort of perpetuation as a system. But slavery is not new. Abolition is not new. The idea that it's a terrible, immoral thing to enslave another human being is certainly not new. So what happens in the drafting of the Constitution is you've got proponents of slavery, of course, you've got slave states, you've got some free states, and you definitely have opponents of slavery because, even in America, this is not new. The Quakers have been saying slavery is barbaric and wrong since like the 1640s.
Okay.
But the problem is that the people who are supporting slavery have a really big stake in this because that's what their way of life is built on. That's what their economies are built on. The people who are opposing slavery actually tend to benefit from it economically. So, the economy that slavery permits is helpful to the northern states. And even if they're not benefiting from it, they don't care enough to really make an issue about abolition. Or even sort of gradual abolition, setting slavery on a path to extinction through the whole nation. They're not willing to fight for that. And the delegates from the southern states repeatedly say, if you don't give us what we want, if you don't give us this recognition and protection of slavery, we're going to walk out. There will be no American nation. And if there's no American nation, then the colonies are not going to do very well because they've been trying to govern themselves with the Articles of Confederation, which is sort of this loose league among more or less independent states. It's not working. The states are fighting with each other. They can't cooperate. There's a real danger that the colonial powers like France and Spain and England are going to come in and dismember the United States. They're going to pick us off one by one. So join or die, that's what Benjamin Franklin says. It really is like a life or death moment for the American nation. And certainly the people on the northern side are willing to give up the rights of the enslaved people in order to preserve the American nation.
It's kind of a deal with the devil. Either, we for right now, we go with it or not.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of important to understand that this recurs through American history, and it gets, I would say, sort of less and less justifiable. So, if you're trying to say, was that the right thing or the wrong thing to do? I think, look, like there are significant values on both sides, right? On the one hand, slavery is a moral abomination. How can we accept that? On the other hand, if we don't, we're not going to be a free and independent nation anymore, right? That's what people are thinking in 1787. Move forward to maybe sort of the next big moment when this happens, I would say it's the Compromise of 1876, when white America decides basically to reunify and heal the wounds of the Civil War by giving up on the ideal of racial equality and multiracial democracy. And there again, like I guess there's a cost because there's an insurrection going on in the South, and you have to have a federal military occupation to keep it down. So you can sort of see there's this, maybe for white Americans, difficult trade-off. They're in conflict with other white Americans, and they don't like that. So it's not the survival of America, but there's some sort of reunification. There's some sort of benefit you get for abandoning the multiracial democracies and the formerly enslaved people and letting their rights be taken away. But then fast forward to like the 1970s or later, and the way in which race is used as a political strategy. And now there's this racial division being promoted basically for its own sake. So politicians now find it useful to say to white Americans, undeserving people of color basically, are trying to take what you have. Like, you're the real Americans, these other people are trying to take it away. They're cutting in line for the American dream. They're getting things they don't deserve. And then you get this white unity forged at the expense of racial equality, and it's just being used to take power. Basically, it's being used for one political party to win elections. And that's, where it's really, really worth condemning, I think.
Right. I want to. I want to take a step back. You contrast the concept of inclusive equality versus exclusive individualism in the Declaration and in the Founders' Constitution. Can you help me understand that a little bit? Because I simply had not come across those concepts before, and it really sparked a lot of curiosity for me.
Yeah, well, so I came up with those terms after like asking some friends what they thought were good descriptions for the ideologies that I had. And I don't know if they're the best terms, and I'm not sure even, if there are other people out there who've said similar things. There probably are. But basically what occurred to me as I looked through American history was you got sort of cycles of these dueling ideologies, where at one moment one has the upper hand and at another moment the other does. And what are they? So if you look at the founding, what I say is exclusive individualism is the ideology of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that's written in 1787. And by exclusive, I mean the political community is pretty closed. There are insiders and there are outsiders, and it matters a lot which side you're on, and it's not very easy to cross the line. So just a couple of illustrations of this. One, look at what the Declaration of Independence says about outsiders, people who aren't Americans. It mentions who? It mentions Hessian mercenaries who are coming to kill the colonists. It mentions Native Americans, whom it calls merciless savages, who are also coming to kill the colonists. And it mentions enslaved people, sort of obliquely at the very end, when it says King George is exciting domestic insurrections. He's encouraging enslaved people to rebel. So 3 groups of outsiders in the Declaration. None of them are going to become Americans. None of them can cross that line. And they're all trying to kill us. So dangerous outsiders. And then in the 1787 Constitution, the big example of this is Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court interpreting that Constitution, and it's a 7-2 decision. It's not just some freakish aberration by rogue justices. We got 7 justices who say this. They say that the Constitution means that Black people can never become United States citizens. So there's a racial line around the American political community. That's the exclusivity. Then the individualism is this idea that's what is important is the individual and individual rights. And you see this pretty clearly in the Declaration, where the whole political philosophy is, imagine individuals in the state of nature, they have their natural rights, but their natural rights aren't secure, so we form a government, and the whole point of government is to protect the rights of the individual, not to make everyone better off, not to pursue some kind of collective goal. So that's the focus on individualism. And you can sort of think about that, like, who are our heroes? Who are the heroes of the revolution? They're people who say that their rights are being violated, and they're going to go to fight, and they're going to defend their own rights. They're taking up arms to defend their own rights. That's the vision of the American hero of the Revolutionary War.
But when they're defending their own rights and they speak of the equality of man, that all men are created equal, it's not that every human being is created equal and they're fighting to defend that right, but they're fighting against a monarch that is given his role by God himself. Is that more accurate?
Yeah, so I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about all men are created equal, and it's a little bit complicated. But here's one sort of interesting historical point. Look at how people read the Declaration in 1776 and what they thought was important. They read all men are created equal and they kind of shrugged. They're like, yeah, I've heard that before. Doesn't really mean much. Now, why would they think that? Well, they wouldn't think that if they read all men are created equal the way that we understand it today, because it's something about equal rights in society. It's about universal equality. It's an anti-slavery principle nowadays. But they certainly didn't read it that way in 1776, because there's no way they would have put an anti-slavery principle in the Declaration as the first self-evident truth. We know this because, one, they blame King George for encouraging enslaved people to rebel, and two, in an early draft of the Declaration, there is a criticism of the Atlantic slave trade, which is importantly different from slavery in America. But even that hits too close to home for the Continental Congress. They take it out. So there's no way they understood all men are created equal the way that we understand it now. They understood it just to mean basically that no one has a divine right to demand obedience from anyone else. And so then they go on and they're like, well, where does political authority come from? And the answer is, it comes when people consent to a government that's created to protect their rights. So you start out equal in the sense that no one has an obligation to obey anyone else. Then you pick some people you like, you form a society with them, you create a government to protect your rights. But importantly, that government has no duty to respect the rights of outsiders, right? And that's why the colonists could say, basically in the same breath, King George is terrible, he's trying to make us into slaves, which is going against the purpose of government. The government's supposed to protect their rights because they're insiders in the British Empire. And also, King George is terrible because he's encouraging the people we enslaved to rebel. Again, it's okay to enslave them. They're outsiders. The government has no duty to respect their rights.
Got it. That is a really good segue into, I think one of the main arguments that I took away from the book is that who we are right now today is much more aligned with the Reconstruction era, the Reconstruction amendments, and that's very much speaking to what you just mentioned, is that at some point the Confederate States became outsiders, and Lincoln, without consent, actually, right, recreated America.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's a couple, I think, of really interesting points there. One is like the way that we think about what government should do now, the way we think about our political community, where does that come from? Well, one, we're much more inclusive. So we don't think there's a racial line around the American political community anymore. We think if you're born here, you're an American. So there's forced inclusion, really. The state of South Carolina in the 1860s would have wanted to exclude a black person who was born in South Carolina. They would have wanted to say, you're not a South Carolina citizen. They can't after the 14th Amendment. So we're inclusive. And we're also more egalitarian. So Lincoln talks about equality all the time. And he references the Declaration, but he's talking about a very different concept. He's not talking about political equality in the sense, if there were no government, would anyone have an obligation to obey anyone else? He's talking about making people equal within society, and he thinks this is a goal that government can pursue. Government can try to lift up the less fortunate. Government can try to make a more equal society. And this goes against the individualism of the founding. And government, during Reconstruction, government now does things that would have shocked people. So during the founding era, there are actually vigorous debates in Congress about whether the federal government has the power to enact disaster relief. So, Charleston
Okay.
Harbor needs to be dredged, Savannah burns down. Can the federal government help those people out who are suffering misfortune through no fault of their own? And people say no at the time. James Madison vetoes a bill. He thinks it's unconstitutional. He's like, that's not what government is supposed to do. We're going to protect your rights. If something bad happens to you, you're on your own. And we don't think that way now, right? We believe the government actually can protect the less fortunate and can lift up the downtrodden. But that's an idea that comes from somewhere else. It doesn't come from the founding. Where does it come
Got it.
from? I think people like Lincoln. And then maybe most obviously after the Civil War, there's a massive part of the American population, the formerly enslaved, who are suffering, who are downtrodden through no fault of their own, are in these terrible circumstances. And we decide for a brief period of time, we're going to try to lift those people up and make them equal so that they can fully participate in the life of the nation. And that's this massive redistribution that the founding world would never have accepted. But we do it during Reconstruction a little bit, not as much as we should have. We don't give them land, which we should have. But we do it a little bit during Reconstruction because we think it's the right thing and it's what's necessary to make America the nation that we want it to be. And this is a very new ideal, this kind of equality as a goal that the government can pursue.
Got it. It's interesting to me and fascinating in the sense that I think some of what you're arguing is, let's have an honest conversation about what we are today. And for me, I've always been taught that patriotism is, yes, loving your country and supporting it, but it's also okay to analyze and critique. In your book, you mentioned there are certain truths about some of our founders and of these documents that it almost feels a little unholy to even be asking the questions. And I can't agree with that perspective. Like what are some of the things that, that people are almost unwilling to hear because for some reason it just breaks down a foundation for them, and I don't understand why.
Well, so I think that people are unwilling to hear that the Declaration of Independence, as it was understood in 1776, doesn't contain the ideals of equality that we think it did. Because we're so used to hearing that, and we hear that
Right.
in really important American documents. The Gettysburg Address, Lincoln talks about this. The I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King talks about this. And if you say to people, that's not how they understood it in 1776, they'll think that you're attacking America, I guess. They'll think maybe that you're saying we're not committed to that ideal, which is not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying we are committed to that ideal, but that means that we're a different America than we thought. So there's lots of bad things about the founders of 1776 and 1787, right? Thomas Jefferson enslaved his own children. That's kind of a bitter pill to swallow. And one reaction that people have, if you say that, is, hey, look, you must be condemning America, right? You're saying there's something terrible about the America of the founding. And guess what? There is something terrible about the America of the founding, and it's slavery. And that carries forward, and you can see it like in the Dred Scott decision, where 7 justices say, under our Constitution, Black people can never be citizens of the United States. Guess what? Maybe they're not wrong. That might not be a terrible reading of the 1787 Constitution. And then the question is, once we come to terms with all of these unappealing aspects of the founding, can we still be proud of America? And I'm saying, yes, we can. Right? So there are people who are out there who are like, America's a racist nation. No, you can't be proud of America. I'm not one of those people. I'm saying you actually
Yeah.
can be proud of America because guess what? We fought a war, right? And that's the Civil War. And we destroyed the Confederacy, yes. And the Confederacy was kind of representing the ideals of founding America. And we destroyed that political system too. And we totally restructured our Constitution and our nation. And we embraced a new set of ideals. And if you understand, 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, or 1868 and the 14th Amendment, if you understand those moments as the birth of America, which they are in terms of the ideals that we now embrace, then you've got a founding story with heroes who didn't enslave their own children. You've got an America that looks really good. And I'm saying just understand that we're that America, and you can love your country and you can be proud of your country, and you don't have to wrestle with so many internal contradictions.
Got it. Tell me about, because yes, I have a dream speech, something I must read once a year, right? Just as inspiration. And he references the Declaration of Independence. But later in his life, after that, his position sort of changed. And you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so later and earlier. And that's kind of the amazing thing to me. So if you read the I Have a Dream speech, and like you, I've read it a number of different times. I wouldn't say I read it every year, but I read it sort of at different stages in my legal education.
Okay.
And before I went to law school, I think I read it and I was like, wow, this is inspiring. He's appealing to our founding documents. And of course, that's right, because America has these ideals from the beginning. I thought that, and then I went to law school and, what is Martin Luther King complaining about in the I Have a Dream speech? In what ways is he saying America has fallen short of the promises that it makes? Well, he talks about racial segregation. He talks about racial discrimination in voting, denying Black people the right to vote. And he says these are breaches of the promises made in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution written in 1787. And then, having taken constitutional law, I was like, wait a second, what is he talking about there? The Declaration of Independence, does that say that you can't segregate the races? That complains that King George is encouraging slaves to rebel. It's like slavery is something that shouldn't be interfered with. What about the Constitution of 1787? Does that guarantee Black people the right to vote? Absolutely not. It doesn't guarantee anyone the right to vote. It's not actually very democratic. It really leaves this up to the states. It protects slavery and recognizes it in a couple of ways. And according to 7 justices, it says Black people can never be citizens, right? Nothing about Black people voting. So, gosh, right? Martin Luther King is appealing to these documents that don't really promise the rights he's talking about. And then the weird thing is, there are some that do. So the 14th Amendment was held by the Supreme Court to prohibit racial segregation. The 15th Amendment, it couldn't be clearer. It says in exactly those words, no racial discrimination with respect to the right to vote. So gosh, why is King appealing to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of 1787, which really do not support him, rather than these much more recent documents that clearly do support him? And you might think maybe, that's just what people do, and he's following Abraham Lincoln or something like that, because Lincoln does much of the same thing, although Lincoln does it before the 14th and 15th Amendments. But it turns out, no, it's not that he didn't know about this other argument that he could have made, because when he was a junior in high school, he entered an oratory competition with a speech called The Negro and the Constitution, which is about very much the same thing as I Have a Dream. It's about, how Black people are entitled to be treated in America. And that speech is all about the Civil War and Reconstruction. He says, we took a new course in 1868 with the 14th Amendment. He says, we defeated Southern armies by the sword, and now we must defeat Southern hate. And if you give Black people the vote, as the 15th Amendment entitles them, we will defend, even by force of arms, the ark of federal liberty against the traitors. So, what is that? That's a pretty hard-hitting, uncompromising speech focusing on Reconstruction, military victory, because that's what it took, and military force to make those rights a reality. And he's embracing conflict and saying, that's the path to justice. But, what happens? Probably, I think, he realizes that white Americans don't like to hear that, especially white Americans in the South. because, the whole thing was we were doing Reconstruction and we gave up on it in the name of white unity. So Martin Luther King, I believe, is saying, I'm going to give you the values of Reconstruction. I'm going to call on you to live up to those values. But I know you don't like the historical episode of Reconstruction, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the founding instead, because that's a moment that white Americans feel comfortable identifying with.
Got it.
And then the punchline later is, I think he realizes it doesn't work because white Americans don't accept this idea. And so, later in his career, he doesn't talk about the founding anymore.
You know what I find so fascinating is, who I really want to be? I really want to believe in the idea that, and we have, in this 30 minutes so far, we've brought up the issue of race on so many occasions. And I want to be the guy who really believes that it's America is above race and that race doesn't have, that's my ideal, I guess, right? Like I want to believe in the ideals of equality, and I've yet to really truly dig in to the 1619 Project. I have some idea of what the concepts are. But am I wrong in that saying so much of our founding and who we are is absolutely based in that? And I've been working in multicultural advertising for the last 20 years. And my perspective has always been, look, let's not deny it. Like when someone looks at me or when I look at you, I ought to have some filters but that's okay, and I don't have to feel bad about that, but simply say, great, I actually love the fact that you're different and I can learn so much from you. But is race really such a fundamental pillar of who we are?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So, race is very, very important in your lived experience in America today. That's one thing. So, like, to say I don't see race, people seem to think like, oh, we should all aspire to not see race. I mean, we can maybe aspire to a society in which race doesn't have the significance it does now. Particularly because a lot of the ways in which race distinguishes people are terrible ways. And people are viewed with suspicion and they're viewed as dangerous and they're more likely to be shot by police, based on their race. And, all of those things are bad. So we can aspire to a society in which race has different or diminished salience. To say I don't see race now seems like just sort of denial. And it's basically very frequently the precursor to, so I don't believe racism exists either because I think everyone's all the same.
Right.
And that's just a ridiculous attitude to take in contemporary America. And then, on the historical point, I think the 1619 Project has been very misrepresented as sort of, what I was saying before. It's an attack on America. It's saying that America is fundamentally racist and has been racist from the beginning. And like it's people who hate America. Read the introductory essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's like so patriotic it brings me to tears. It's about feeling like an outsider and then realizing that she really is an American and understanding all of the things that Black people have given to America. I have something to say about that later, where I think Black people are absolutely central to the development of American ideals. But basically, a lot of the 1619 Project is just showing you how race explains current features of American society. So you might wonder, like, why do we have highways going right through the cities the way that we do? Like in Philadelphia, we've got highways dividing neighborhoods. Gosh, that seems stupid. It doesn't help with the traffic. We've destroyed the sightline for lots of neighborhoods. Why do we do it? It has something to do with race.
Redlining.
So many features of American society. Yeah. And American exceptionalism also. So if you look at ways in which we're different from other industrialized democracies, like America does it one way and everyone else in the world basically does it the other way. Like all of Europe and Japan and Korea, whatever. 9 times out of 10, the reason we do it differently has its roots in race. So you really can't understand American society without looking at a history that considers the role of race.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Constitution itself. It's funny because I've over the years I've had fights with people, everyday people, not professors of constitutional law or history, that say, well, it's not in the Constitution. And it strikes me that it's almost spoken about as a biblical text, something that cannot be altered or changed. But in fact, I think the word amendment actually means add, right? Add and change. We haven't touched the Constitution since, I think, 1992, and that might have been about congressional salaries and something to that effect, which, like, who cares, right? But why is it made to be so hard? And do we ever, right now, I can't, I know for a fact our Congress is going to shut down the government for the budget in January. And like, if we as a society want a fundamental change in which we need to enact it through a constitutional amendment, for example, the right for reproductive rights, do we honestly, in this system that we currently live in, the way we've morphed it, do we have hope that we can ever actually adjust or amend to the Constitution?
It's very difficult. I think most people would say the constitutional amendment process is too difficult. If you talk to constitutional law professors, most of them will say that's a defect. And I think that's true, but there's a slightly different way of understanding what the problem is, because, hey, look, we did have a bunch of amendments. Some of those amendments were enacted through somewhat unusual ways, like the 14th Amendment, notably. But other ones weren't. We got the progressive era amendments that changed society in significant ways and gave more power to the federal government, and made it clear that the income tax was constitutional, pretty significant, gave women the right to vote. We did things through the amendment process. Why can't we do it now? The answer is basically political polarization. So the Constitution, the whole thing, was not drafted for a two-party system. The framers did not expect that to happen. They didn't really think about national political parties. They thought about local political parties, that could operate within a state, and they called them factions, and they thought factions are bad. How do we get away from the influence of faction? We're going to have a big American nation, and the national government will be too big for any one faction to capture. But now we've got national political parties, and they fight against each other. And just about any constitutional amendment that you can imagine is going to favor one party over the other. So if you're changing the structure, like if you're changing term limits, for instance, if you're getting term limits for Supreme Court justices, or you're getting rid of the Electoral College, things that lots of Americans support. But unfortunately, whenever you do that, it's going to benefit one party and hurt the other, and the party it hurts is going to oppose it. And you need 3/4 of the states to ratify. You need 2/3 majorities in each houses of Congress to even propose an amendment. So in an America that's closely divided and sharply polarized, it's never going to happen. And that's why we can't amend the Constitution, really. It's political polarization.
And you brought up I've, as far as I remember, I've always said, man, it'd be great if there were term limits for Congress. Like, I just, there's so many reasons I can't believe people can be in Congress for so long. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But only within the last decade has it been brought to the forefront of my head that the most venerable institution that I grew up with, the one group of people that you could not touch, that this is nothing but the purest group of oracles that guide us, the Supreme Court. And now that it seems to be a political tool, and it kind of saddens me. has the question of like where did this issue of or this thing of lifetime appointments come from, and it, could there potentially be any avenue where that may be changed in my child's lifetime, perhaps?
Yeah, so life tenure comes from the Constitution. It says the judges shall hold their office during good behavior. And we know why the
But
framers did
what's
that,
yeah
right? They
yeah
explained
what's
it.
the reasoning behind that?
Well, they wanted judicial independence. So the idea is you're a judge, you're safe in your position, you can't be fired, you can't be rewarded for deciding a case a particular way. So, you're going to decide the case the way you think is best. Judicial independence. Um, and at the time, I think there wasn't a lot of experience with independent judiciaries. So maybe life tenure seemed like it was necessary. But, the thing that I would say about that reason now, so you mentioned before, like people don't like the idea of amending the Constitution because it seems almost sacred. Um, if we know what the framers were trying to do, and we can achieve that goal in some better way, I think we can go ahead and amend the Constitution. So what they wanted was judicial independence. There probably, weren't that many independent judiciaries for them to use as examples. Now we've got a lot, right? We've got 50 American states, for instance, right, which are very culturally similar to the United States as a whole, of course, right? These are the 50 states that make up the United States. And how many of them have chosen life tenure for their judges? One, it's Rhode Island. Rhode Island's got life tenure. Rhode Island is probably not the model we want to follow. This is a little bit specialized, but the Rhode Island courts are not considered the best out of the state courts.
Okay.
No offense to Rhode Island, but life tenure just doesn't seem to be doing good things for them. And then there's the question of the rest of the world. No other modern industrialized democracy has life tenure. So everyone else thinks judicial independence is adequately protected by a lengthy fixed term. We just went a little overboard there, maybe. Alexander
Right.
Hamilton was very enthusiastic about judicial independence, did a little bit too much, maybe.
Yeah, and like it truly does sadden me that they've become, and maybe I'm exaggerating. I'm a layman, and maybe they're not as much a political pawn as I believe them to be. At least that's the standard
Well,
story I'm telling
so
myself.
it's a very interesting question, I think. Like, why do they seem political to people now when they didn't seem so political, 20 or 30 years ago? Because
Because there's been Republican presidents who've nominated liberal judges and vice versa before in history.
right, so it used to
Now
be
it
the
seems like there's
case.
no way.
Right. It used to be the case that presidents would be surprised sometimes. A Republican president, Eisenhower, nominates Earl Warren, who turns out to be super liberal. John F. Kennedy nominates Byron White, who turns out to be pretty conservative on some issues. He dissents in Roe v. Wade. Presidents don't get surprised now. But the other thing that's happened, I think, is it's a combination of factors that lead to it. But if each president has an equal impact on the composition of the Supreme Court, you're going to get a Supreme Court that kind of reflects mainstream American views. Because when you win a national election and the people support you, you get to put some justices on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to reflect that understanding of like how the world works, that worldview, that constitutional vision, maybe you could say. But the thing about life tenure is it's unpredictable. You don't know how many appointments a president will get. You might get 0 in one term, like Jimmy Carter. You might get 3 in one term, like Donald Trump. And when that happens, and you've got political parties fighting for control of the court, and now they're putting onto the court these reliable, ideologically predictable justices, you can get a situation where a party wins a minority of elections, like they win 5 out of the last 8. And they win the electoral vote once out of the last 8 elections. So they're really representing a minority view, but they get, like this is the world we live in, a 6-3 advantage on the Supreme Court. We've got 6 Republican appointees and 3 Democrats. And so that court is pushing a vision that represents a minority of the American people. And of course it looks extreme and political. So like what I was suggesting before was in the past, people didn't think the court was so political, not because it wasn't deciding contestable questions based on value choices. It certainly was doing that. It's sort of inevitable with the Constitution we have the way it's written. We got these vague, value-laden provisions. Justices have to decide cases involving them. They're going to be making something like political judgments. But as long as those political judgments reflect the vision of mainstream American society, they don't look so political. They look like common sense. Maybe they look like wise statesmanship. It's when the court starts representing fringe views, extreme views, that people are like, wow, that's a political court. Because your own politics don't look so political to you. It's when they're extreme and different that they look political. It's sort of like, in God we trust on the coins. Hey, that's familiar and inoffensive. In Allah we trust. That would shock everyone. But like, it's the same thing. So like, why does this happen? What's the problem? The problem is life tenure. And the solution to that, what I was suggesting before, is term limits. Because if you give each justice an 18-year fixed term, then each president can appoint 2 justices per 4-year term. Then presidents have an equal impact on the court. Then the court stays in line with mainstream society and isn't trying to impose these fringe views on us, which is what's going on now.
Okay, yeah, that sounds logical. That sounds reasonable. Let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we should. And this is not my idea. 24 years ago, the co-founder of the Federalist Society, Stephen Calabrese, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling for 18-year term limits with, I think, Akhil Amar, liberal originalist Yale law professor. It used to be a bipartisan idea because pretty much everyone could see, gosh, that makes sense, right? The way that we're doing things now, it really doesn't make sense. Term limits, each president has equal impact. That would make a lot more sense. And then, like I was saying before, it turned partisan, because now the Republicans have this advantage. And if you put in term limits, it's going to take that away over time. So partisan politics, the party that's in power is going to cling to whatever enhances its power.
I hate being a pessimist. I fight, I battle with my own pessimism. The divide, the partisanship. I can't believe we're only 4 or 5 days from a national election, and we're talking about garbage, right? The word garbage about our own citizens being tossed around, and I hate feeling like that suggestion, which you just gave. It sounds so reasonable to me. Feels so impossible to where, I don't want to think we have to have. And I don't think it's going to happen here immediately, no matter which candidate gets elected. I think we all just want to go to Costco, and we're all, like my dad once told me, if you're fat enough, you'll go with whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd hate to think that we have to get to a place of absolute desperation in order to enact some of these changes. Am I that far off that, it takes enormous, not bloodshed necessary, but enormous effort that maybe we're not even prepared for, that maybe even the documents that we follow are not elastic enough to allow us to enact that change?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. Progress in American history doesn't usually come through sort of gradual incremental improvement. Usually, like, there's something bad, there's conflict, and then we get a lot better after the conflict. The one thing that I would say, maybe we could move forward without enormous conflict in some ways is, I think that we could improve the functioning of democracy if we could just get like a party that represents the majority of the American people in control of all 3 branches of the government. And let me say, like, it could be either party. But there's a structural thing that goes on when a party that represents a minority controls the federal government, which is they want to stay in power. The parties always do. They know that a majority of the American people are against them. What are they going to do? How are they going to hold power? Well, hey, they could like reach out to the American people and try to change their minds and try to win broader support, but they tend not to do that. What they tend to do is try to suppress the majority and interfere with democracy and prevent the majority from having its way. And that's bad. And there's a bunch of features of the Constitution that actually help them do that. Equal state suffrage in the Senate, the Electoral College, the lack of term limits for Supreme Court justices. All of those things help the minority hold power. But if you could get a majority in control for a while, and like really a strong majority, then they would have incentives to do things that would help them stay in power by improving democracy, by letting the majority have its way. So we might, see the National Popular Vote Compact, which allows us to do an end run around the Electoral College. We might see term limits. We might see rules against partisan gerrymanders. If the majority can take power, then it has an incentive to improve democracy because that's how majorities hold power. Having the minority in power, that's a bad thing.
Right. My most, and I really try to be selective in these conversations, but in the debates I have around certain dinner tables or at the cigar shop, the ultimate, after arguing, and I mean going at it hardcore, the level ground we seem to all agree on is, let's be honest, I think we're all getting played a little bit by the two-party system. So I know we got to wrap it up, and I'm almost asking on behalf of my son and my daughter. He's a 20-year-old, wants to be an attorney, wants to change the world. He's got that optimism that I'm going to learn this and I'm going to do what I can. Given you are a law professor, what is your hope? What is it? What do you see in this generation that perhaps takes us to these changes that we were just discussing?
Well, I always say that like my students give me hope. And they do, because each generation comes along with idealism and energy, and they're going to go out there and they want to make the world a better place. And like we've got this sort of perpetual supply of young people getting older and taking their place in the world and acquiring power and getting the ability to try to translate their ideas into reality. And I think it's like our job to try to give them the best ideas that they can use and figure out what works and what doesn't. And like what you just said about the two-party system makes me think ranked choice voting, because the two-party system really does mess things up. Two-party system is a bad way to do things. And why are we stuck in this two-party system? Basically because if you vote for anyone else, you're throwing your vote away. No third party has a chance. But we could fix that. This is another way, like democracy, in some ways, there are pretty simple fixes to a lot of these problems. If we had ranked choice voting, where you don't pick just one candidate, you're like, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, here's my third choice, you can vote for the person you really believe in, like the third party that really embodies your ideals, even they got no chance of winning, you put them first. And then they take, say, the top five. Final five voting is a suggestion, is a way to implement this. They take the top five, they see who has all the votes, and then they take out the person who has the least. So like the person who finishes fifth out of those top five. And everyone who voted for that person first, they look at their ballots and they're like, now we go on to your second choice. So if you voted for that person first, you don't end up having no voice. You've made your voice heard. You're like, this is my top choice. Listen to me, right? And then your vote goes to someone else. And maybe that puts them over the top. And now they know that they won because of the supporters of this other person. And then maybe they, moderate their policies or they take that into account. Anyway, so like ranked choice voting could fix a lot of our problems. This was a great, great idea. It would make things a lot better. And that's being tried. There are organizations working for that. Final five voting is one of them.
And is it crazy if I suggest, you know what, I want the taxpayers to pay for the political campaigns? Yeah. All of those five candidates get $10 million for a 2-month campaign, and that's it. You don't get to take money from anyone else, not even from Victor, because I sell T-shirts and I want to pass
Yeah,
legislation.
that would be great. I mean, I think campaign finance reform is long overdue. The problem there, of course, is the Supreme Court, which keeps telling us the First Amendment protects the right of corporations to drown out the speech of everyone else and distort the marketplace of ideas, which seems to me like that's a stupid interpretation of the First Amendment. But that's what they think.
Yeah. Honestly, I could keep you here for hours and hours and hours, and I clearly need to get into law school in order for me to do that, and I'm not smart enough for that. But honestly, I can't thank you enough for taking the time, for accepting the invitation. The book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story, really impactful to me, and I say that with all honesty, and I will share it with everyone that I have these conversations with on a daily basis.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate it. Great talking to you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.